thanks everyone for joining us tonight for our November History Talks. And History Talks, most of you I think have been on, but always a reminder, we do these monthly author speaker series talks in which you get to hear from the authors of books about South Dakota. Many of them come from the South Dakota Historical Society Press, of which I'm the director. And tonight we have two of our authors who are authors of other South Dakota Historical Society books. But for tonight, they are contributors to the Plains Political Tradition, Volume 4. And we have a few other contributors on as audience members too. So we can have a really fun time when we get to the Q&A. So we're going to start with Sean Flynn. We've got Sean Flynn and Paul Higbee as our speakers tonight. And I'm really grateful that Paul was able to get out of Sturgis, where a blizzard forced him for 12 hours, and home. He made it home to Spearfish. I almost forgot. I was like, wait, Spearfish. Spearfish is home. And the rest of South Dakota is getting cold and a little bit snowy. But here we are and able to from the comfort of our homes, enjoy hearing from these authors. So we'll start with Sean. I am going to recommend to you all that if you know how to get onto the gallery or the view button on your screen for Zoom, that you put it on speaker. And that way you'll get the big view of Sean as he's presenting, and then of Paul. And I'm going to stop screen sharing so that I can allow for that to happen. So on my screen, view is in the top right-hand corner, and I'm going to click on speaker, and I get Catherine. But when Sean started speaking, I think it will switch around. So a quick introduction to Sean Flynn, and I should actually back up a second and say this is Plains Political Tradition Volume 4. That we just released this a couple of months ago, and Volume 4 tells you there are 3 earlier ones, and they've all been really great compilations, anthologies, we call them, of about 9, 10, 11 essays in each one that try to explore the political culture of South Dakota and a lot of different areas of that political culture. So as the introduction by the editors of this one, which are John Lauk and Paula Nelson, give a very broad definition to that political culture. So it goes from everything from tax structure to German language newspapers to political campaign ads to Karl Mundt, which is the topic of Sean's talk for us tonight. Sean is currently working on a book about Senator Karl Mundt and the Cold War. And a chapter of that book will be devoted to, a chapter of that book will be devoted to Mundt's critical role in the Hiss case, which is what his chapter in Plains Political Tradition is about. So I give you Sean Flynn, who is a professor of history at Dakota Wesleyan University and has been a long time, a big help to us at the South Dakota State Historical Society, and was on our board of trustees for quite a while. So thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Deidre, for that nice introduction. In general, my essay examines this spat or this rivalry between the Midwest and the Eastern establishment that had to do with the severity of the communist threat, the domestic communist threat in the United States, and how that threat affected our national security. And I entitled it "The Eastern Establishment on Trial, Congressman Karl Mundt, Inland Republicans and the Hiss Case." And the term Eastern Establishment was a term used quite a bit after World War II and up until at least the 1980s or so. And it simply referred to the elite, the Eastern elite, the Wall Street, State Street, Madison Avenue, Ivy League elite that held important positions in government, in the State Department, Department of Defense, or sitting in the Oval Office, or important congressional committee chairs. The idea that the Eastern elite had been bred to rule, they had gone to the right schools, They came from the right cultural class, the aristocratic class of American society. It was kind of bred for government service and civil service. And they looked down upon and had a disdain, you might say, towards Midwestern Republicans or inland Republicans. In fact, Dean Acheson, a paragon of the Eastern establishment and a Secretary of State in the 1940s, referred to the Midwestern congressmen as the primitives. They were provincial, they were narrow-minded, they were communist witch hunters, they were obstructionist when it came to trying to carry out the foreign policy of the United States. And there was a lot of tension between Midwesterners and Eastern elites when it came to foreign policy making issues. For their part, the inland Republicans or the Midwesterners like Munt didn't think very kindly of the Eastern elites. They thought they were smug and arrogant and privileged. But more importantly, there was a concern among Munt and many Midwestern congressmen and many Midwestern citizens in general that the screening policies of the Roosevelt administration had been too lax. And during the New Deal, a lot of Ivy Leaguers, a lot of these Eastern elites had gotten into high-level government positions in the civil service or in bureaus and departments of the government without proper screening. And a lot of these leftists, these socialist sympathizers, these communist sympathizers, were actually communist agents who had penetrated the government and were conducting espionage efforts on behalf of the Soviet Union. So that was a concern that the inland Republicans had for the Eastern elite. The Eastern elite saw the inland Republicans as obstructionists, narrow-minded witch hunters. Midwestern Republicans saw the Eastern elites as a threat to the national security. They were threatening to allow the Soviet government to penetrate the highest levels of American government. A little bit about Karl Munt, though I'm sure a lot of your listeners know quite a bit about Karl Munt, who's been in the news lately since John Thune tied his record for most consecutive elections as a US Senator in South Dakota history. But Munt, before he became a congressman, was a college professor. He was at what is now Dakota State University in Madison. He taught speech and debate. He was literally, I'm not exaggerating, one of the great speech and debate coaches in America in the 1930s. His teams were some of the best teams in the United States. And had he remained in academia, he would have gone down in history as probably one of the great college debate coaches in higher education history. But he decided to run for Congress in 36. He was defeated, but he won a seat in the House of Representatives in 38. He served in the House from 39 to 49. He served in the Senate from 49 until 73, though he did suffer a debilitating stroke in 1969 during his fourth term in office. When he arrived in DC, Munt lobbied hard to get on a committee called the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or Hugh Act. It's better known by its acronym, Hugh Act. It was a high-profile committee that got a lot of press coverage, and it also reflected the views of a lot of Midwestern constituents that Munt represented. In that, their purpose, the purpose of Hugh Act, was to investigate communist espionage, domestic communism, and the infiltration of the US government. And their investigations and the evidence they gathered during testimony before Hugh Act was to support the efforts of the FBI and the FBI's investigation of domestic communism. Now, initially, when Hugh Act was founded, they were searching for both Nazi infiltrators and communist infiltrators, but it was pretty evident by the 1930s that the Nazis weren't working very hard to infiltrate the American government. And the threat really came from Moscow. And it was good. It was good for Munt's career. Him getting on that committee was extremely popular back in South Dakota. South Dakotans felt like they had somebody on a very important committee who was a communist hunter, a communist headhunter, and could protect the national security of the United States that many American Midwesterners felt was being threatened by these communist agents. And Munt will help bring down Algerhis. And my essay examines this effort by Hugh Act to get Hiss, and Munt and Nixon played the key roles. Richard Nixon and Karl Munt were good friends and became good friends because of this. And those two men played the key role. Most history texts, when the Hiss case is mentioned, talk about it launching Richard Nixon's career, which it did. Nixon became a household name because of the Hiss case, but it also launched Munt as a national figure as well. because of his performance, especially during televised hearings during the Hiss case. The Hiss case really begins in 1948 when a woman named Elizabeth Bentley testified before Hugh Act. And she was a self-professed former communist who had run spy rings in World War II. And she told Hugh Act at a time when Munt was the chair of Hugh Act, that a lot of new dealers, she had recruited a lot of new dealers, and the new dealers were some of her most important agents that had worked with her in the spy ring during World War II. That gave a big boost to Hugh Act, and Munt became really serious now about trying to extrapolate more on some of these charges that new dealers were involved in this process. He gets a tip from a Washington reporter, a good friend of his, who says, you know what, you should contact Whitaker Chambers, the senior editor of Time magazine, and ask him to testify. He's a self-professed former communist, and he was involved in a communist spy ring in the 1930s. He's given the FBI some information. I think he would help your committee out. Munt invites him. He was not a convincing looking witness. He was kind of a frumpy, rumpy dressed man, unpressed clothing, overweight. He slumped when he spoke, kind of listed to one side, this bored, monotone voice. And a couple times Munt had to tell him to speak up. You know, he can't hear you. He didn't look really convincing as a witness until he mentioned the name Algerhis, at which point everybody sprung awake, because Chambers claimed to have known Hiss very well in the 1930s and had worked with him as a Communist Party agent in the 1930s. It sent shockwaves to the committee room because Algerhis was a known figure. He was a rising star in the Washington establishment. Johns Hopkins University undergraduate, Harvard Law School degree. He'd clerked for Oliver Wendell Holmes. He'd been an attorney on several New Deal agencies. He was at Yalta, at the Yalta Conference with Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, deciding the future of Eastern Europe and Asia. He was an architect of the United Nations. He was the president of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. He was being groomed, you might say, for an undersecretary of state or a secretary of state role. His friends were Dean Acheson, John Foster Dulles. This man had all the credentials to be a great leader in the State Department. And here's this rumpled looking man accusing him of espionage. And yet Chambers in his testimony provided some detailed evidence about his relationship, and Hugh Act was left with the feeling that, you know, we should pursue this. This could be possible. The next day, Munt gets a telegram from Hiss, who discovers his name's been made as he opened up his morning newspaper with a cup of coffee. He contacts Munt. He says, I've been slandered. I deny all of these charges of being a communist. I want my day in court. I want to be able to appear before Hugh Act to deny these charges. He's brought in on August 5th, 1948. As a witness, he is the polar opposite of Whitaker Chambers. He's well-groomed, he's elite, he's well-spoken, he's witty, he's articulate, he's the embodiment of the Eastern establishment. And he denies unequivocally ever knowing anybody by the name of Whitaker Chambers, having any knowledge of Whitaker Chambers, having been involved in the Communist Party of the United States, having followed any Marxist doctrine. He says, you can bring forth all the witnesses, character witnesses you want, and they'll all tell you the same thing. I've never been involved with the Communist Association, and I've certainly never been involved in espionage. And when he's done with his testimony, he has wowed the entire room, Hugh Act, the Washington Press Corps, any witness, with one exception. Everybody in the room felt that the more credible witness, Whitaker Chambers versus Algerhis, was Algerhis. Algerhis seemed like someone who was telling the truth. Whitaker Chambers seemed like something of a nut, with the exception of Richard Nixon. We now know that Nixon had some inside information that had focused attention upon Hiss's role as an agent. But to Nixon's credit, he felt like even in this first testimony, Hiss was being evasive. He was not answering questions correctly. And yet it would be Munt's decision whether or not the hearings would be scotched at this point. And Munt wanted to end the process of the Hiss investigation. He felt like, in his mind, Hiss was the more credible witness. The reputation of Hugh Act would be tarnished if they continued this pursuit of Hiss. Nixon begged him and he says, okay, I'll give you a chance, Dick. I'll form a subcommittee. You can chair the subcommittee. You can interview quietly in a hotel room in New York, Chambers. You can interview Hiss and then interview them together. Come back, give me an update, but it's going to be my decision whether or not this case goes forward, because I'm not going to risk the reputation of Hugh Act chasing someone who's innocent. Nixon conducts these investigations, or Nixon and a small team of Hugh Act members conduct these interviews. And in the interviews, it's clear Chambers knew Hiss well because he could provide such detailed information about his home, his furniture, his carpet, his family, his kids, his car. He was an ornithologist, where he traveled, the money he loaned Hiss, just time after time after time, this detailed information. When Hiss comes to the hotel room for this private conversation, he's evasive. And at one point he says, you know what? I did know this guy in the 1930s who looks vaguely like Whitaker Chambers, who went by the name of George Crossley. And George and I had a very short acquaintanceship. I lent him some money. He was a broken, he was a writer who didn't have a lot of money, and I supported him with a couple of loans, but I didn't know him well, never seen him after that, had no professional relationship with him. That gave the committee enough evidence that they felt like these two men should face each other in public under scrutiny in front of the entire panel to determine, okay, who's telling the truth, who knew who. And at this point, Munt becomes the key figure in the Hiss case. He wants these hearings televised, and he wants it held in the House caucus room, this huge cavernous chamber that holds like 1,500 people. Plenty of the Washington press corps would be there. It could be televised. And in 1948, not a lot of people owned television, but it's estimated that millions did actually watch what was the first televised congressional hearings in American history. This was the first of what would be a series of famous televised hearings, such as the Army McCarthy hearings, or Watergate, or Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill, or Iran-Contra Gate, or the January 6th committee. The first one, the mother of them all, was this, what was known in Washington as Confrontation Day, when Hiss and Chambers would appear before cameras. And Munt becomes the center of attention at this point because he was such an excellent cross-examiner. And Nixon even says in his memoirs what a great cross-examiner he was. And going into the televised hearings, by the way, how much time do I have, Deidre? I don't want to shortchange Paul.
You're doing fine. You're doing fine.
Great.
Keep going.
Great. Yeah, at this point, Munt is pretty well armed going into televised hearings, because he has evidence that Hiss and Chambers had known each other for at least 2 years. And of course, Hiss had denied this, but the smoking gun in all of this was a car title. And from the very beginning, Chambers had said, I had a use of this car for long periods of time. It was an old Model A Ford. And I had use of it for a long period of time, which of course Hiss denied. But they were able to locate the title and discover that Hiss had sold the car after letting Chambers use it for a long period of time to a communist car salesman, who then sold the car to a fellow Communist Party member in the Washington, D.C. area. And all of this created this timeline. This is the key for your listeners. There's this certain timeline that debunks all of Hiss's claims and undermines all of Hiss's claims. And in this cross-examination period, Munt puts him on a burner and really demonstrates how evasive he is as a witness. And Hiss comes out of the televised hearings looking really bad. Chambers comes out looking really, really viable. The damning moment, and those are the words of David Halberstam, the great New York Times journalist, the damning moment in the entire Hiss case was Munt's summation at the end of the televised hearings, when he lists off time and again how honest Chambers had been, providing verifiable information, factual information that the committee could determine was accurate, and how evasive time after time after time Hiss had been. And he basically tells America watching this, based upon this one list of truths that we can verify and this long list of evasions, I'll let you decide, the American people, who's telling the truth, Whitaker Chambers or Algerhis. And to the television audience, it was clear Chambers was the much better witness, the more truthful witness. It was a damning moment. It was a great summation. Probably no lawyer could have made a better summation. And of course, Munt had a mastery of the English language and a vocabulary and a command of the English language. And he does just wonderful job. I won't bore you with the details. You'll have to read the essay article, this confrontation between Hiss. Long story short, a couple of days after this event on television, Chambers does an interview, a radio interview with NBC News, and suggests that Hiss is still a communist, that he's still a practicing communist agent. Hiss sues him for slander. Chambers responds by going out to his Maryland farm, and some of you might know about the famous pumpkin papers. In a hollowed out pumpkin, in a pumpkin patch on his Maryland farm, Whitaker Chambers has 2 canisters of microfilm. And on that microfilm are dozens, scores of photographs of documents, classified documents signed by Algerhis, classified documents that came across the desk of Algerhis that he had given to Whitaker Chambers. Whitaker Chambers had served as a courier, took those classified documents to a Soviet agent in New York and handed them to the Soviet agent. It's damning evidence, and it leads to the indictment of Algerhis. That the statute of limitations for treasonous activity or espionage had expired, but he was indicted on perjury charges for lying to Congress about his relationship with Algerhis. He is convicted. He is sentenced to 5 years in prison. Algerhis will do 44 months in a prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. When he gets out, he becomes a stationery salesman in upstate New York, kind of a Dunder Mifflin paper salesman. He dies basically a broken man, claiming to the end that he was innocent and he had never done anything wrong. He'd been framed, he'd been slandered. We know that now is a lie, because in 1995, following the opening of the Soviet archives, it was proven without a doubt that 350 Americans, New Dealers, spied for the Soviet Union during the 1930s, and one of those men was Algerhis. The documentary evidence is there from the Kremlin. It's been demonstrated that this spy ring did exist. The Midwest is vindicated. These supposedly witch hunting communists from the Midwest who had suspicions about the weak screening policies of the Roosevelt administration have proven their point, and it boosts Munt's career. By the way, he was running for the U.S. Senate in 1948. So obviously this is going to propel him back home. The Sioux Falls Argus Leader and all the major newspapers proclaim him a hero. It does a lot to launch his own career. It makes him a center of communist, domestic communist investigations after that. And of course, as many of you will know, he chaired the Army McCarthy hearings and had a very complicated relationship with Joseph McCarthy. But that's because he was a trusted anti-communist fighter. So very much an important chapter in American Cold War history, and a South Dakotan was at the center of it.
Sean, thank you for that. So fascinating. And of course, there's always that illusion, the great pumpkin part of the Peanuts Halloween special. Always that kind of like background allusion to this whole
there you go.
Chambers his case. So,
yep.
So what we're going to do is have Paul speak next, and then when Paul's done, we'll have a Q&A session. I'm sure you all have lots of questions for Sean already, and you'll have more when we have Paul speak. So Paul Higbee is a writer, a columnist, and kind of the Black Hills correspondent for South Dakota Magazine, but he's done lots and lots of other things in the Black Hills over the years. And he's also currently the president of the West River History Conference organization. And I learned at the West River Conference a year ago that he writes really funny lyrics for cowboy music that they perform at the High Plains Western Heritage Center in Spearfish. So go to that show sometime. It's really funny. Right. Paul is going to tell us about Francis Case and Lyndon Johnson. At least that's what his article is about in Plains Political Tradition. He kind of compares the two men. There are a lot of overlaps, a lot of similarities between them. And that comparison helps to highlight a lot of things about South Dakota political culture. So, Paul, take it away.
Well, thank you very much. I guess the very genesis of this story happened in 1962. My family lived in Iowa, and we came out to the Black Hills in the summer of 1962. And my parents really liked President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson. And we got to Rapid City, and Lyndon Johnson was in Rapid City. And I don't know if my parents encountered him really, shook hands, but they saw him in downtown Rapid City. Years later, I thought, why was Lyndon Johnson in Rapid City in 1962? Am I remembering that wrong? Was he really there? And so I did a newspaper search, and I found out, yes, he was. He was in Rapid City to attend the funeral of South Dakota Senator Francis Case. And he said some really glowing things to newspaper reporters covering the funeral. And it sounded like there was really a relationship, a friendship there. Now, Case was a Republican. Johnson, of course, a Democrat. And yet it didn't seem like the things that Johnson was saying were just things that you would say if there wasn't really some feeling behind the sentiment. So I looked into it, and I found out, yes, they had a long relationship. They understood one another very well. While I was doing my research and telling people what I was discovering, they said, well, it must have been in a time, the 1930s, 40s, 50s, when politics were less partisan. That would have been an insult both to Johnson and Case. They considered themselves highly partisan. Nobody did more to raise money for the Democratic Party candidates all across the country than Lyndon Johnson. Case, nobody needled President Harry Truman more than he did. He traveled the nation to repudiate things that he knew that Truman would say when he gave speeches. But they seemed to know that when an election was over and they'd raised all the funds they could and got elected who they could, they needed to settle down and do business. And they worked together very, very well. So Case, Republican, Johnson, Democrat. Some other differences. Case was a short, reticent, soft-spoken man. Johnson was a giant of a man, both physically and in his mannerisms. Some other similarities, though. They both considered themselves Westerners, and they both believed that Westerners needed to stick together because they saw all the power being in the East. And so they identified as Westerners. Both of them raised Hereford cattle. Both of them were real proponents of getting minerals, be it gold or oil, out of the ground to make profits. Both of them were ardently anti-communist. And I would say that in reading Sean's article, I think they would be proud to be called inland primitives, because they believed that they were right, that those communists needed to be watched very closely. Both distrusted unions. Both were highly committed to what they called preparedness, which meant after World War II, building up military preparedness. They both became really giants in the national civil rights movement. And I'll get into that at the end of my talk. And that was surprising to a lot of people, especially Johnson with his Democratic ties to the Deep South, and Case being from South Dakota, where he himself said nobody talks about civil rights, but he was very much an ardent supporter of civil rights. Both men died in their mid-60s of heart disease, of heart attacks. I was going to say they both struggled with heart disease late in life, but they never really got to late in life. They were both gone by their mid-60s. They grew up, both of them, and they knew one another's stories well in parched Western lands. Johnson in the Texas Hill Country. Case, in a very formative part of his childhood, on a dry homestead near Bear Butte. And when they got to Congress, both entering Congress, House of Representatives in 1937, they first thing they were going to do was improve water conditions in their districts. Johnson developed irrigation in the hill country of Texas and in North Texas, and later moved into using those same sources for electrical generation. Right behind him, in fact, at the same time, Case was establishing reservoirs in the Black Hills that would water low-lying ranch lands. And watching what Johnson was doing in Texas, he started thinking about, could we dam the Missouri River and generate power there? That's how they both learned kind of the ropes of Congress. That's how they both gained a reputation. That's how they got to know one another. They came to Washington, as I said, in 1937. Their wives, as newcomers to Washington, became good friends. Everything changed in December 1941. The United States entered World War II. Both voted for the act of war. And then the next day, they each went their own way. Case to join the U.S. Marines, Johnson, the U.S. Navy. Case had been in the Marines during World War I, and he was told, thank you for your offer to come back in, but we need you more in Washington than we do in the Marine Corps. Johnson was told the same thing by the Navy, which he had never had any association with or with any other branch of the military. However, he did get a very short-term Navy assignment from President Roosevelt that a lot of his colleagues for the rest of his career said was much more of a publicity stunt than active World War II service. That was over by the next spring. And then Johnson and Case both jumped up to what their real work was during World War II, and that was winning military facilities and training in their home states. Now, Johnson had a huge advantage. They had in Texas coastal facilities for the Navy, already a lot of aviation centers. All Mr. Case had in South Dakota was, in his West River district, was a frontier military fort. That was Fort Meade, and a National Guard facility at Rapid City. And he said, well, we're going to change that. We're going to bring military missions to South Dakota. And what he ended up doing was establishing Ellsworth Air Force Base, revamped Fort Meade, so that was a medical center with an attached military cemetery. He put a munitions station in Igloo, South Dakota. And he also brought an Army aviation training program to Black Hills Teachers College in Spearfish. It was very successful, and for the first time really bringing major military installations to South Dakota. Post-war, they both established in Congress, in the House of Representatives, a reputation as two congressmen who were very suspicious of labor unions. They both believed that military production during World War II had been hampered by labor unions who slowed down production. A lot of people today look back at that and say, really, no, we had all the equipment we needed produced by American industry, but they both believed that and made a case to limit the power of unions. In fact, Senator Case wrote a bill that kind of preceded the Taft-Hartley Act, which when the Taft-Hartley Act came along, both Johnson and Case endorsed it wholeheartedly to somewhat limit the power of labor unions. And then both of them were looking at the US Senate. And I've got to say, a difference between the two men is Lyndon Johnson absolutely knew he was a lifer as far as federal service in Washington, D.C. And you can look at some of the things he said back in the 1930s, and he was thinking about the presidency. At any rate, Johnson was never going to leave Washington, D.C. if he could help it. Case, on the other hand, he said, I think I'm going to serve one more term. He said this a number of times. And then I want to go back to the Black Hills. He had by that time a place in Custer where he ran a few cattle. And one thing he always mentioned is, you know, he said, in Washington, we do ceremonies, we do parades where some of us ride horseback. He said, I can't find a decent horse in Washington, D.C. I want to go back to the Black Hills where I own a whole herd of really good horses. And then people say, okay, well, what are you going to do day to day other than your horses? And he said, I'm going to be a historian. I'm going to write Black Hills history. And was always talking. When he retired, he would come back to South Dakota and write Black Hills history. But it was in the Senate that Johnson and Case worked together more than any other time. And it was post-World War II, big time for their pet projects in military preparedness. Both of them came to believe in the Titan and Minuteman missile programs, which would fire missiles out of the Great Plains across the North Pole to Soviet targets, because now, of course, the Soviets were the concern. They both really pushed those programs. Lyndon Johnson got a lot of credit as being the architect of NASA, and he always said, well, my interest in rocketry had nothing to do with exploring space. I'm glad that happened, but he said it was all military preparedness. Difference between South Dakota and Texas when these missiles were installed was Texas was too far south to actually be able to accept any of those missiles. South Dakota sat right in the sweet spot. And of course, many farmers and ranchers gave up some of their land so they could be the home of missile silos. And Case thought this was so important for South Dakotans to do. He would drop about anything to get on the phone and talk to some rancher who thought he might want to sell his land for a missile silo. Also, all through the 1950s, and this had to do with preparedness, the interstate highway system, of course, was to be a military highway, moving military equipment and personnel back and forth across the continent. And both of these men got that. They pushed hard for the interstate highway system. And Case said, you know, these highways have to go everywhere. Now, I said, you know, the urban areas have the money through bonds to be able to build through their cities. And he said, that's fine. There's going to be commerce there too. And in fact, we hope that's never used for moving war equipment. But he said, if it's going to be a military highway, we need to make sure it goes through places like South Dakota. And so Case, really more than any other senator, and this was something Lyndon Johnson acknowledged, worked to come up with funding that was not, for these highways, that was not just based on local bonds, including a federal gasoline tax. And we all know the story of Senator Case outsmarting Hubert Humphrey, or so the legend goes, making sure I-29 went north and south to Fargo up the South Dakota side instead of the Minnesota side of the border. And I believe that's true, but he had a much bigger role nationally to play in development of the interstate highway system. The one big blow up these two men had, and it's amazing, it was over and they were really angry. And then they were right on to something else the next day. Johnson really took care of oil and natural gas in Texas, and he wanted to get it deregulated in 1953. And it looked like he was going to be able to get it through the Senate pretty easily. And then on the floor of the Senate, Senator Case stood up and said, I'm going to oppose this bill of Senator Johnson's because I think I was approached with a bribe. And indeed, $2,501 bills, or no, I'm sorry, $2,500 bills, $2,500 was brought to his office in Sioux Falls from this representative of natural gas. Lyndon Johnson said it was a campaign contribution. Case said, no, it was a bribe. And Johnson was furious and he said, you know, there are just some people in South Dakota that need to be taught some manners. So both of them were really heated in their comments. But the very next month, they were working together to censor Senator Joseph McCarthy. And this was a hard one for Senator Case because he really believed what Senator McCarthy was doing in hunting down domestic communists. And he knew that his voters back home, his constituents, really believed in that work too. But he said, I just cannot tolerate having a man in the US Senate who is as crude and as personal in his attacks as Senator McCarthy. So he said, I'm going to give him, Senator McCarthy, the opportunity to retract some of the offensive things that he said. And if he says that, I will not be in favor of censoring him. Now, this is when Case was on a 6-member select committee to recommend or not recommend censoring Senator McCarthy. Well, McCarthy refused to retract anything. And Case said, that's it. He should be censored. And of course he was, which really broke McCarthy personally. And I think hurt Senator Case a little bit back here in South Dakota. Big thing, the two men came together, Johnson and Case, though, was the 1957 Civil Rights Act. And, you know, it wasn't a real far-reaching act, but it was the first time the federal government, through the Senate, asserted itself through the Senate and signed by President Eisenhower, saying that civil rights is not just a state's issue, it's a federal issue. And so in the summer of 1957, the 1957 Civil Rights Act was passed. The next day, it was mostly voting rights. It was not very far reaching, but Lyndon Johnson by this point had decided civil rights was going to be his big identifiable issue nationally. And by getting it passed in 1957, it opened the doors for federal action all the way up through the Johnson's presidential administration. And the day after this passed, Lyndon Johnson wrote to Senator Case and he said, for the courage of your convictions and the precision of your mind, the country should always be grateful. You played a major role in bringing about an effective bill that honorable men can accept. Johnson believed, as did most of Case's colleagues in the Senate, that when Senator Case decided to try to help a bill by writing it or rewriting it, he wrote bills that were better regardless of what side of you were on this issue, because it just made everything clear. And that's exactly what Lyndon Johnson thought about Senator Case's rewriting of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. As he said, you made it so as something that honorable men can accept. Senator Case ran for a third term, or was going to run for a third term to the Senate in 1962. In June of that year, he died of a heart attack. So he did not get to see Johnson become president 18 months later after the assassination of Kennedy in Texas. In a strange way, Lyndon Johnson's connection to South Dakota was through Senator Case. And he was always, because he could work with Senator Case, he was always befuddled by why it was so hard for him personally to reach South Dakotans, especially when he tried to bring money here for Democratic candidates. But it is interesting that when he ran for president, when Johnson ran for president in 1964, he became the first Democrat to carry the state since Roosevelt, and the last to date. He won South Dakota's electoral votes. And I think that Johnson, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he might say that was the first really easy thing that ever happened for him in South Dakota. And, you know, there were people who said, yeah, Johnson, Case, they're kind of cut from the same cloth. Of course, Johnson went on hoping his administration would be all about civil rights and other social programs. It got bogged down by Vietnam, and he really pointed the finger at Georgia McGovern as a senator from his own party that made it hard for him to do what he wanted to do in Vietnam. And there's no doubt in my mind, he would prefer to have had Case, a Republican, still in that Senate seat rather than George McGovern. So two men, very different in some ways, truly similar in a lot of ways also, and they could always work together. So that's my presentation.